Hello everybody, welcome. I'm No02 and thank you for watching this video. This is part 2 of my Sami guide, where we are going to be discussing Sami's tank problem. Yes, Sami has a tank problem, most of you already know that. Be sure to check the timestamps. Everything will be broken down nice and neat for you. Because we're going to go over we need to all be on the same page here for a couple of things, right? We're going to go over bonus damage, minus damage, why we care, why it's so significant, why we care so specifically about the tank, the 7,000 gold tank, over all of the other direct units that are also being affected by her minus 10%. We care most about the tank. Some of the solutions that Sami has for those particular issues, and how we can, in a very general sense, use them. We're not going to dive super deep into how to use these 4 units that will allow Sami to defeat her enemy's tanks. We will save that for future videos, replay examples, things like that, content down the line. We just want to have the basic understanding, the foundation of knowledge, so that as you are playing Sami and learning how to play her, you are looking at these 4 units, you're thinking about them, you're learning about them, you're getting comfortable with them, because they are going to end up being sort of like your primary tools in order to beat your opponent's tanks, especially in the long run here. So, minus damage, bonus damage, why do we care? Let's all understand this simple fact. Whether you have extra bonus damage or minus 10% direct damage like Sami does, what does that actually mean? What does that quantify itself into in a real match? And it boils down to how many units do you need to eliminate an enemy unit? You'll commonly hear a 2-hit KO. 2-hit KO. That's actually sort of the baseline, the golden middle ground that we're really looking for when it comes to our units eliminating enemy units. 1-hit KO is obviously better, but in order to achieve that, you need some sort of unit discrepancy, like a medium tank shooting an enemy recon. That has a pretty good chance of one-shotting it, right? Or, on the other side of the spectrum, why do we not want a 3-hit KO, right? 1-hit KO is hard to achieve. 3-hit KO, though, we don't want that because, keep in mind, each unit only has 4 surface area. You can only hit an individual unit with 4 separate direct units. That is the most you can hit it with. You can't shoot diagonally in this game. Well, unless you're a ranged unit, right? But we're not worried about that. We're worried about our direct unit. Just in a general sense, it's far easier to block 2 sides of a vehicle. You get death balls going in. Having access to 3 sides of a unit can be hard to achieve as well, and thus, that beautiful mid-ground that we're hoping to get is that 2-hit KO. And when you have minus damage or bonus damage, it can be easier or harder to accomplish that 2-hit KO. Now, there's a variety of circumstances where this may or may not happen because of cities and cover and forests and how many comm towers do you have, and of course, just the general what CO you're using and things like that. Lots of circumstances. So when it comes to Sami, very specifically, and tank versus tank, Sami tends to struggle a little bit. In fact, if Sami does not have a comm tower, she's got her 90% damaged tanks, she takes 2 of them and shoots an enemy tank on a road, it is still a damage roll as to whether or not she actually destroys it. I think it's a pretty good damage roll in your favor, but still a damage roll nonetheless. The tank is on a plains, right? The grasslands, the savanna, that 1-star defense. She ends up needing, again, a damage roll in order to accomplish a 2-hit KO. And you can imagine now that if your opponent's tank is on a forest, Sami can't hit it. Sami can't 2-hit kill it. It's on a city, it's even harder. Keep in mind too, as a match goes on, your units don't typically get healthier. They get worse and worse. In a 2-hit KO scenario, the first tank that you engage with takes a little bit of return fire. 8, 9, 7 damage in return. It all depends right on cover and who you're fighting and things like that. But the end result is, naturally over time, Sami's tanks will get weaker, your opponent's tanks will get weaker, but that minus 10% will naturally lend itself to you being able to 2-hit KO tanks less often, and less often, and less often. And against a good player who understands this weakness that you have as a Sami player, you'll find yourself really struggling to maintain a sort of tank Cold War. If you're a Sami player and you're locked into building tanks or trying to just beat your opponent tank to tank, Sami will typically lose in the long run. Their tanks just can't compete because eventually her ability to accomplish those 2-hit KOs just falls away. Just can't do it. You end up needing 2 tanks and an infantry, 2 tanks and a 3rd tank, and it gets worse and worse over time. But why do we care about the tank so much specifically? There's other direct units as well. I mean, like anti-air, right? They shoot what they shoot. Sami still gets 1-hit KOs with that. Medium tanks versus medium tanks. Yes, that's not in Sami's favor, but for the most part, you don't really ever find yourself in that particular circumstance all the time. We care about the tank because it is unbelievably common. The tank is common. The tank has a huge amount of coverage. The tank is the workhorse of just about every single army composition that you're going to come across. Every CO, every map, standard, fog, doesn't matter. You will see 2, 3, 4, 5 tanks being built over the course of the match. Sometimes 3 tanks in the same area at the same time. It is super common to build tanks. They are everywhere. And what I mean by they have really good coverage, for 7,000 gold, a tank will kill just about everything, except for air units, and the tanks that cost more than it. The medium tank, the neo tank, what have you, right? The tank will literally kill everything except for air units and the more expensive tanks. That's about it. And so that's the tank for its price and its 6 movement. The tank is an incredibly versatile unit. Get a lot done. It is the workhorse of just about every single army composition. Thus, how does Sami deal with that? By not building tanks, because we lose long term in a tank versus tank Cold War. Now granted, if you had some sort of economic advantage, maybe you can just brute force tanks over your opponent, and there might be some strategy and validity to that, but Sami's more elegant than that. He's more elegant than that, and a lot of times solid opponents, good opponents, aren't just going to let you have a free economic advantage at the beginning of the game, right? So it all is a little circumstantial. But what are the units that Sami is going to be looking towards to deal with her tank problem? So let's go to those 4 units. Look at those beautiful graphics. Oh my goodness, the graphics, right? Again, we're not going super deep into these units. We just want to understand, in a very general sense, what these units accomplish for us, why we want to look to them specifically, so that we can sort of get the knowledge, maybe get some new build orders, understand that these are the units that we want to be focusing on to sort of directly fight our enemy tanks. And this sort of ends up being the reason why Sami army compositions end up looking different than a lot of other COs, because she tends to be lighter on the tank, heavier on these 4 units here. So we have Mechs, artillery, B-copters, and medium tanks. Mechs. We're going to have an entirely separate video for Mechs specifically. Mechs and transports, a match made in heaven. Some strengths, but a lot of weaknesses, right? Mechs, though, Mechs do more damage than our tanks, as well as our B-copters, versus enemy tanks. That's cool. If one of our Mechs gets on top of an enemy tank and we get the first strike, that enemy tank is going to be running for the hills. Hurts. It hacks it up pretty good. The issue is, though, that Mechs have no defense, right? Infantry, a unit that's cheaper than it, counters Mechs. And even if the infantry mech trade isn't super favorable for the infantry, trading an infantry into a mech to protect your tanks is what the infantry's job is anyways. That's the infantry's job to begin with. And so you never want to be trading your mechs into infantry, which can make it quite hard to get your mechs into contact with enemy tanks, because if tanks are the workhorse of every army composition, mechs are the backbone. They're everywhere. They're the thing that holds everything together, maintains the economy, protects your expensive units. Mechs have a serious problem with trying to get to tanks. Not only that, tanks have 6 movement, mechs have 2. Technically, mechs can never catch a tank. Now we need, an APC to transport it around. That's more expensive than a tank to begin with. It takes an extra turn to unload it. There's a lot of problems with the mechs here. But that doesn't mean we not build them, right? But it does mean that we need to look at the mechs, understand their weaknesses, understand their strengths, and begin to figure out how to use them, get comfortable with them. So if you're going to be a Sami player, you need to get comfortable with mechs. Not necessarily mech spam all the time, right? Mechs will vary from map to map, of course, like every other unit. But we want to be comfortable with them. We want to look at the map in terms of mechs. Where are they good? Where are they weak? How can I use them to the best of my ability on this map? Things like that. Because not only do the mechs trade super well into the tanks, they're also way more economic. Can be a huge boon for you to get a mech onto a tank. Not only that, if we're building mechs as one of our key units to deal with enemy tanks, hopefully that yields the production of other units somewhere else. If we're building mechs versus tank, we got an extra 400 gold to do something with. Again, naturally lending itself to Sami having a different looking army composition because he's just building more different units. Next is artillery. Artillery, of course, have their obvious weakness with the tank having enough range or enough movement to get on top of the artillery. The artillery needs a unit count to be advantageous, right? Unit count. Artillery love to be surrounded by friends and family. If you don't have that meat wall, tanks will destroy artillery. Artillery can't move and shoot in the same turn, obvious weaknesses, but if the artillery can get a hit off on an enemy tank, the damage is pretty good. It's a really good trade-off. In fact, the trade-off is the same as every other CO. Sami's artillery ranged units are not affected by her minus 10% damage. And so in a sense, sometimes you can play on some maps as if you were Grit. Granted, Grit's a pretty circumstantial CO, but we basically are the inverse of Grit. We have really powerful infantry and normal artillery, and Grit is normal infantry with powerful artillery. But again, this is another tool that you want to be looking towards to potentially deal with your opponent's tank problem. Especially, too, in a lot of the early game, you're going to be going up against infantry tank as your opponent's primary army composition for a couple of turns. Your infantry artillery composition can absolutely beat a tank infantry composition. It absolutely has that potential to do so. And over the mech here, the artillery has 5 movement. Now, granted, it's not the 6 of a tank, but if an artillery moves, it also has its range, so in theory, an artillery can cover 9 squares of movement potentially. So in theory, the artillery can sort of maneuver to some degree with the tanks. You're not going to chase a tank down with an artillery, right? But the artillery, at the very least, can reposition to ward off tanks, hold cities, things like that. The artillery will have some great value to you when it comes to dealing with tanks in your Sami games. Next one is B-copters. And essentially, B-copters are just like flying tanks. B-copters and tanks, from my understanding, have pretty much the same damage as far as their main weapons are concerned. I don't know about their secondaries, right? The reason why tanks don't trade well into B-copters is because B-copters get to shoot their missiles. Tanks don't get to use their main gun versus the helicopters. They got to point their little LMGs up and pray for the best. And thus, B-copters naturally trade really well into tanks. And for Sami, that's still the case. So, Sami's B-copters are still going to struggle to 2-hit KO enemy tanks, just like her tanks are going to. The fact that her helicopters are taking, significantly less damage in the return fire, though, means that Sami's B-copters still counter tanks, like everyone else's B-copters do as well. In fact, right, even if your B-copters aren't killing the tanks can't fight the copters back. Your enemy tanks aren't going to try and first strike your B-copters. That would be madness, right? So again, B-copters here are going to be a really solid solution potentially dealing with tanks. We do need to worry about anti-air, though. You can't just spam B-copters. Funny enough, anti-air not only one-shots our B-copters, but also a lot of anti-air is going to one-shot your infantry. So funny enough, if your army composition is only infantry and B-copters, your opponent literally only has to build anti-air, and you can't win. You can't win unless you somehow get your mechs on top of their anti-air. And again, it's the same issue in general with mechs. That's really hard to do. But B-copters will allow you to also very comfortably chase tanks around. And again, this is just another tool, right? We're not going super deep into this. Just keep in mind, though, that the B-copter is going to be one of those tools that allows you to chase down tanks, deal with them, force your opponent to build anti-air, and be a part of this unique army composition that Sami might have. You're going to have a little bit of everything. Menagerie. The last thing is medium tanks. Medium tanks still shred tanks, right? Sami's medium tanks will still deal with lots of tanks. Sami's medium tank can easily kill 2-3 tanks, especially if he gets the first strike on one of them and things like that. It's never going to be a favorable trade for your opponent to shoot their tanks into your medium tank. The only exceptions would be like Mechs using like his CO power, his super power, right, to shoot your tanks down with lots of little tanks, and eventually that works. But even in that circumstance, the first tank gets a hell of a return fire. So for the most part, Sami's medium tanks are capable of dealing with your opponent's normal tanks. Some of the issues they're going to have, though, is one less movement. Got 5 movement. The difference is the artillery's got 3 range on it. The medium tank does not. So sometimes keeping your medium tanks in pace with your enemy's normal tanks can be an issue. Can be an issue with front switching and things like that. So we'll have a whole other video about Sami and the fog, and medium tanks being weak in fog is one of those issues, right? A little spoiler for you there. Also, medium tanks cost way more than tanks, right? Cost 16k in gold, where tanks cost 7. So the circumstances of medium tanks is that you can't use a medium tank in the early game. If you obviously everything's circumstantial as far as the map and your build order, but medium tanks will come later for the most part as one of your solutions for dealing with Sami's tank problem here. But again, something that you should look to, pay attention to, learn about, get comfortable with, so that you can be more fully prepared to deal with Sami's tank problem, because you are going to run into that issue of just, if you build tanks to match your opponent's tanks, or if you build only mechs to deal with your opponent's tanks, you build inherently into your weakness, and you end up losing some way or another an opponent who's just going to outsmart you with their army composition because you're just ogre gaming into mechs or ogre gaming artillery. Sort of need a menagerie of these 4 units to deal with the tank problems to some varying degree. I'm not saying you need one of each here, but you should probably have 2 of these or 3 of these to some degree at some point in the match, right? So, I hope this was helpful. If we can do a little summary here, right? We care about the tank because it does so much in every single matchup. Sami struggles in that tank versus tank matchup because of her minus 10%. Struggles to get that 2-hit KO. Some of the key units that she can use to combat tanks is mechs, artillery, B-copters, and medium tanks. All have their strength, all have their weaknesses. And in future videos here, we're going to be going over mechs, transports in depth. Artillery, B-copters, medium tanks will we'll go over them in match replays and things like that, and build orders and stuff like that as well. But look to these units. Learn about them, love them, favor them, because they're going to be the units that will give you, even though inherent weaknesses, also obvious strengths as far as how they deal with tanks in their own particular way. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it, and I will see you in the future.